I don't want a child. Take the money and leave before you become a problem I have to manage, said the Mafia boss. This chilling command sets an immediate tone of danger, pitting a mother's love against a ruthless empire. My beautiful family, welcome back. May the Almighty clothe every woman in peace that no storm can steal, strength that never bows, and grace that never fades. May your hands never grow weary of doing good, and may every scar become proof of the battles you've conquered. Remember, your courage is someone else's miracle. A like is a prayer whispered. A comment is a bond renewed in faith. This is a mission for 1,000 likes for every woman who rose after being broken, who smiled through pain, and who still believes in love. If your heart beats with hope, like this video. If your soul walks in faith, comment, Elena's Army. The air in Dante Moretti's private study was thick with the scent of aged mahogany, expensive bourbon, and the metallic tang of unspoken violence. It was a room where fates were sealed, and lives were traded like commodities. Elena Vance stood in the center of the Persian rug, her fingers digging into the leather of her handbag so hard her knuckles turned a ghostly white. She had walked into this room with a flickering candle of hope in her chest, believing, perhaps foolishly, that the man who had whispered her name in the dark for the last 6 months would see the world differently now. She had spent 3 days rehearsing the words, imagining a softening in his steel-gray eyes, a momentary lapse in his predatory armor. Instead, Dante didn't even look up from the ledger on his desk. The overhead light caught the sharp lines of his face, making him look less like a man and more like a statue carved from cold, unyielding stone. He was the heir to the Moretti Syndicate, a man whose very name kept the city's underworld in a state of perpetual submission. To him, everything was a balance sheet. Everything was a strategic move. Dante, she whispered, her voice fracturing the heavy silence. Did you hear what I said? Finally, his eyes lifted. There was no warmth in them, no recognition of the nights they had spent together. There was only the clinical detachment of a butcher examining a cut of meat. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached into the top drawer of his desk and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. He slid it across the polished surface. It stopped just inches from the edge, a physical barrier between his world and hers. I heard you, Elena. I'm not deaf, he said, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm vibration. But you seem to be under a delusion regarding your position. I am currently in the middle of negotiating a merger with the De Luca family. A marriage alliance is the cornerstone of that treaty. A scandal, especially one involving a child of unverified lineage, is a liability I cannot afford. It is a quarterly loss I am choosing to mitigate before it reaches the books. Elena felt as though he had reached across the desk and physically struck her. Unverified lineage? You know it's yours. You're talking about a human life like it's a bad investment. In my world, it is, Dante replied. He leaned back, the shadows of the room swallowing his tall frame. That envelope contains enough to ensure you never have to work another day in your life. It is the price of your silence and your permanent absence. Take the money and leave before you become a problem I have to manage. And believe me, Elena, you do not want to be a problem on my desk. The word manage hung in the air like a death sentence. In the Moretti vocabulary, managing a problem usually involved a shallow grave or a concrete floor. The man she thought she knew, the man who had shown her a sliver of vulnerability in the quiet hours of the morning, was gone, replaced by the monster the world feared. He wasn't just rejecting a baby. He was erasing her existence to protect a throne built on blood. Elena looked at the envelope. It was heavy, bloated with the currency of her betrayal. For a moment, her vision blurred with tears of pure, agonizing heartbreak. But then, something shifted deep within her. The vulnerability that had defined her for the last few months vanished, replaced by a cold, white-hot spark of defiance. She realized that the man sitting across from her wasn't a king to be pleaded with. He was a poison to be avoided. If she stayed, if she took his generosity, she would be tying her child's soul to a monster who saw them as a line item on a ledger. She didn't reach for the envelope. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, her spine turning to iron. She met his gaze, and for the first time in their relationship, she didn't look away from the darkness in his eyes. "You're right, Dante," she said, her voice steady and devoid of the tremors that had plagued her just moments ago. "I don't want to be a problem on your desk. I don't want to be anything to you at all. Keep your blood money. I don't need it to raise a Moretti. Because, as far as I'm concerned, this child has no father. He has only a mother who knows exactly what kind of man you are." A flicker of something, was it surprise or irritation, passed over Dante's face, but it was gone before she could truly identify it. "Don't be a martyr, Elena. It's a role that leads to a very short life. Take the money. It's the only mercy you're going to get." "I don't want your mercy," she spat. "I want your absence." She turned on her heel and walked toward the heavy oak doors. Every step felt like she was walking through wet cement, her heart screaming at the finality of the movement. Behind her, she heard the soft scratch of a fountain pen on paper. He was already back to his ledgers. He had already moved on to the next transaction. As she stepped out of the mansion, the heavy iron gates closed behind her with a final metallic clang, and the skies opened up. A torrential downpour began, the cold rain soaking through her thin coat in seconds. She didn't run for cover. She let the water wash over her, feeling it cleanse away the scent of his cologne and the memory of his touch. She stood on the sidewalk, a lone figure against the backdrop of the Moretti fortress, and made a silent vow to the life growing inside her. She would vanish. She would build a wall so high that no syndicate could scale it. She would become the dawn after this long night, and she would never let her child know the coldness of the man who had just traded their future for a seat at a table. Elena Vance was no longer a victim of a mafia boss's whim. She was a mother with a mission, and a mother with nothing left to lose was the most dangerous force in the world. The first thing Elena did when she returned to her small apartment was not cry. The luxury of tears was for those who still had a safety net. She was now walking a tightrope over an abyss. With the rain still dripping from her hair and the chill of Dante's study settled deep in her marrow, she began the clinical process of erasing herself. She knew the Moretti reach. Dante might have claimed he wanted her gone, but he was a man of absolute control. If he changed his mind, or if his merger required her silence to be more permanent, he would look for her. She started with her digital life. Elena was a strategist by trade, and she knew that in the modern world, a person was just a trail of breadcrumbs left across servers and satellites. She sat at her laptop, her fingers flying across the keys with a cold, rhythmic precision. She deactivated her social media accounts, not just hitting delete but scrubbing the metadata first. She closed her bank accounts, moving her modest savings into a series of credit union accounts under her mother's maiden name, a name Dante had never bothered to learn. Next came the physical ties. She packed only what could fit into 2 sturdy suitcases. She left the designer dresses Dante had bought her, the jewelry that felt like gilded shackles, and the perfume that smelled like his penthouse. She kept only the essentials: her grandmother's locket, her legal documents, and a single ultrasound photo that was still just a tiny, hopeful blur. As she moved through the rooms, she felt like a ghost haunting her own life. Every corner of the apartment held a memory of a man who didn't exist, a man she had invented to fill the void of the monster she had actually been sleeping next to. By 3 a.m., the apartment was stripped of her soul. She left the keys on the kitchen counter next to a pile of mail she would never open. She didn't call a rideshare service. Dante's tech team would have flagged her account within minutes. Instead, she walked 3 blocks to a late-night bus depot, keeping her head down and her hood up. She bought a ticket in cash to a city 3 states away, a redirection she had no intention of completing. The bus ride was a blur of neon lights and highway hum. At the 3rd stop, a sleepy transit hub in the middle of nowhere, she got off and disappeared into the crowd. From there, she took a series of local shuttles and private car hires, zigzagging across the map until she was certain any tail would have been snapped. Her final destination was a place that didn't appear on any of the Moretus maps. Her grandfather's old vineyard in the rolling, fog-drenched hills of the northern coast. The vineyard, Sempre Verde, was a relic of a different time. It was a sprawling, overgrown estate that had been forgotten by the world since her grandfather's passing. The vines were wild, the farmhouse was weathered by salt and wind, and the nearest neighbor was 5 miles down a dirt road. It was the perfect fortress. When she finally pulled up to the rusted iron gates in a battered old truck she'd bought from a farmer, the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon. The light wasn't the harsh, clinical gold of the city. It was soft, filtered through the mist, turning the world into a watercolor painting. Elena stepped out of the truck, her boots crunching on the gravel. The air was sharp with the scent of sea salt and damp earth. She walked up to the porch, the wood groaning under her weight. She didn't have the key, but she knew the secret. She reached above the doorframe, her fingers finding the heavy iron skeleton key tucked behind a loose beam. As the lock turned with a satisfying, heavy thunk, Elena felt a weight lift off her chest. For the first time since she had seen the ultrasound, she breathed. Inside, the house smelled of beeswax and old books. It was a tomb of her childhood summers, preserved in dust. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't need to. She walked to the window and looked out at the rows of grapes that stretched toward the cliffs. This was where she would bury Elena Vance, the girl who loved a monster. And this was where she would build something new. She spent the next week in a fever of activity. She established a secure, encrypted satellite connection for her freelance work, ensuring her IP address bounced through 6 different countries before hitting a client server. She reinforced the locks, cleared the brush from the perimeter, and stocked the pantry with enough supplies to last a winter. She was building more than a home. She was building an outpost. But the physical labor couldn't drown out the silence. At night, the house was too quiet. The only sound the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the cliffs below. She would lie in the oversized bed, her hand resting on her still flat stomach, and wonder if she had made a mistake. Dante's words would echo in the dark. Take the money and leave before you become a problem I have to manage. The fear was a cold companion, but it was also her fuel. Every time her heart wavered, she remembered the way he hadn't even looked up from his ledger. She remembered the envelope. She was a problem he had managed by throwing money at it. Well, she was going to be the one problem he could never solve. She was a ghost now, and ghosts didn't care about mafia mergers or family legacies. As she stood on the cliffs at the end of her first week, watching the sun sink into the gray Atlantic, Elena whispered a promise to the wind. He will never find us. He will never touch you. You are mine, and this world is ours. The vanishing was complete. Elena Vance was gone. In her place was a woman of the shadows, a mother preparing for a war she hoped would never come, but one she was now ready to win. If you believe a mother's courage can bring even a king to his knees, like this video. Comment Elena's army if you're standing with her. The morning of the first prenatal appointment in this new life was shrouded in the kind of thick silver mist that only the northern coast could produce. Elena sat in the waiting room of a small, nondescript clinic 30 miles from the vineyard. She had chosen this place specifically because it didn't use a centralized digital portal. Here, records were still kept in manila folders, and the doctor was a woman whose eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen every kind of secret and judged none of them. Elena felt like a fugitive, her heart hammering against her ribs every time the clinic door opened. She had dyed her hair a dark, muted chestnut and wore glasses she didn't need, trying to mask the woman Dante Moretti had once called his own. When the nurse finally called the name Elena Miller, the alias she had adopted, she stood on shaking legs. The exam room was small and smelled of lavender and antiseptic. Dr. Eris, a woman with graying hair and a steady voice, motioned for Elena to lie back on the table. The gel was cold against her skin, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the city she had left behind. "Let's see what's going on in there," Dr. Eris said softly, moving the transducer across Elena's stomach. The monitor flickered to life, a grainy landscape of shadows and light. For a long moment, there was only the static hum of the machine. Then a sound filled the room. Thump thump. Thump thump. It was the sound of a heartbeat, rapid and fierce, like a tiny drum calling for a revolution. Elena felt a sob catch in her throat. It was real. Despite the betrayal, despite the cold study and the blood money, there was life. But Dr. Eris didn't stop. She moved the transducer again, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Wait a moment," she murmured. Another sound joined the first. Thump thump. A second heartbeat. Elena's eyes widened, her hands gripping the edges of the table. Twins. She was having twins. The thought was terrifying and beautiful all at once. 2 lives to protect. 2 reasons to never look back. "Elena," Dr. Eris said, her voice dropping to a whisper of pure awe. "Look at the screen." The doctor adjusted the angle, and the grainy image shifted. Elena watched as 2 more distinct flickers appeared on the screen, nestled together in the crowded space of her womb. Thump thump. Thump thump. 4. The silence that followed was deafening. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Quadruplets. It wasn't just a pregnancy. It was an explosion of life. 4 heartbeats were echoing in the small room, a synchronized symphony of defiance against the man who had said he didn't want even one. Are they okay? Elena managed to choke out, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own blood rushing in her ears. "They are small, but they are strong," Dr. Eris replied, her eyes meeting Elena's with intense gravity. "But Elena, this is a high-risk journey. Your body is going to be under immense strain. You're going to need rest, nutrition, and a support system. Carrying 4 is a monumental task." Elena stared at the screen, tears finally spilling over and tracking down her temples. She didn't have a support system. She had a derelict vineyard, a fake name, and a past that was hunting her. She thought of Dante's face when he had called a child a scandal. What would he say to 4? He would see them as a 4-fold threat to his legacy, or worse, he would see them as soldiers to be groomed for his dark world. In that moment, the cosmic joke of the situation hit her. The man who wanted to erase his lineage had just been given an army. But he would never know. He didn't deserve the sound of these hearts. He didn't deserve to know that his blood had created something so miraculous. "I can do it," Elena said, her voice growing stronger with every beat of the 4 hearts. "I have to do it." The months that followed were a testament to human endurance. The brutal nature of the pregnancy began to take hold. Elena's body changed with a frightening speed. Her back ached, her feet swelled, and the fatigue was a heavy cloak she could never take off. She spent her days at the vineyard farmhouse, moving between her computer, where she worked late into the night to build a financial fortress for her children, and the porch where she stared at the sea. She became a student of her own survival. She learned which plants in the garden provided the most iron, how to brace her body to keep the pressure off her spine, and how to breathe through the Braxton Hicks contractions that started far too early. She was a solitary sentry, guarding the most precious cargo in the world. There were nights when the isolation felt like a physical weight. She would look at the empty side of the bed and remember Dante's arms, the way he used to pull her against him in his sleep. She would feel a pang of longing so sharp it felt like a knife, followed immediately by a wave of self-loathing. How could she miss a man who had offered her an envelope to kill his own children? She would press her hands to her stomach, feeling the frantic overlapping kicks of 4 growing lives, and use that pain to sharpen her resolve. By the 7th month, she could barely move. Dr. Eris began making house calls, bringing supplies and checking the 4 heartbeats in the quiet of the vineyard. "You're a marvel, Elena," the doctor said one evening, packing up her stethoscope. "Most women would have broken by now. But you're like the vines out there. You've dug your roots deep into the rock." "I don't have a choice," Elena replied, looking out at the twilight. "They are the only family I have left. I won't let them down." As the birth neared, Elena prepared the farmhouse for a new kind of chaos. She bought 4 cribs, second-hand, and scrubbed them clean. She knitted 4 tiny hats, each a different color: blue, green, yellow, and white. She was no longer just Elena Vance, the strategist. She was the architect of a new world, a world where 4 children would grow up surrounded by the smell of grapes and salt air, never knowing the shadow of the Moretti name. The 4 heartbeats were her compass. They were her 4 small mercies in a world that had shown her none. And as the first real contractions began on a stormy Tuesday in November, Elena didn't feel fear. She felt a fierce, predatory readiness. The war was beginning, and she was bringing her army into the light. The vineyard house, once a tomb of dust and memories, transformed into a fortress of laughter, laundry, and the relentless rhythm of 4 growing lives. 5 years passed in a blur of salt air and sleepless nights. Elena Vance had become a ghost to the world, but to Leo, Luca, Liana, and Luna, she was the sun around which their entire universe orbited. She had raised them to be fierce and protective, a miniature pack that moved with a synchronized intuition that only quadruplets could possess. Leo was the silent observer, possessing his father's steel-gray eyes but none of his coldness. He was the first awake and the last to sleep, always patrolling the porch. Luca was the heart, the one who could sense a shift in Elena's mood before she even felt it. Liana was the fiery, sharp-tongued, and brilliantly fast one, while little Luna was the dreamer, often found talking to the vines as if they whispered secrets to her. Together, they were a force of nature that kept Elena's hands busy and her mind away from the shadows of her past. By day, Elena worked as a covert freelance strategist, her fingers flying across an encrypted keyboard while the children played in the rows of grapes. She had built a reputation in the digital underworld as the Ghost, a consultant who solved impossible corporate puzzles without ever revealing her face or location. The money she earned was funneled into a complex web of offshore accounts, ensuring that if they ever had to run again, they could survive for a lifetime. However, mothering in the shadows came with a heavy price. The name Moretti was a forbidden word, a poison she refused to let cross her lips. The children knew they were special, and they knew they had to stay within the boundaries of the vineyard's stone walls whenever a strange car passed on the distant road. Elena had turned their isolation into a game of the secret kingdom, but as they reached their 5th birthday, the questions began to sharpen like hidden blades. "Mama," Luca asked one evening as they sat on the cliffs watching the sunset, "why do the other kids in the books have a father? Did ours get lost in the sea?" Elena felt a familiar coldness prickle at the back of her neck. She looked at his innocent face, so hauntingly similar to the man who had discarded them. "Your father was a man who chose a different path, Luca. He lives in a world of stone and shadows, and we belong to the light and the vines. We are enough, aren't we?" "We're a pack," Leo interjected, stepping up to stand beside his brother. "Packs don't need anyone else." Elena pulled them both close, her heart aching with a mixture of pride and terror. She had succeeded in keeping them safe, but she realized she was raising them in a beautiful cage. She was a woman of the shadows, and her children were becoming creatures of the mist. She had erased her digital footprint, but she couldn't erase the DNA that pulsed through their veins, the Moretti ruthlessness that manifested in Liana's competitive spirit or the strategic brilliance that Leo displayed when he organized their missions in the garden. The world outside, however, refused to stay forgotten. As her business grew, Elena was forced to take on higher-profile clients to maintain their lifestyle. A prestigious tech firm in the city, the very city she had fled, sent an invitation for a final, in-person consultation that would secure her children's financial future for decades. It was a risk, a crack in her armor, but the vineyard was failing, and the children needed more than salt air to survive. She spent weeks preparing, convinced that 5 years was enough time for the world to have moved on. Dante Moretti was likely married to a De Luca heiress by now, his life filled with corporate mergers and syndicate wars. He wouldn't be looking for a ghost. He wouldn't be looking for the woman he had managed out of his life. She stood before the mirror on the morning of her departure, dressed in a sharp, professional suit that felt like a suit of armor. She had dyed her hair a deep ink black and wore contacts that turned her eyes a soft hazel. She didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. This wasn't the broken girl from the penthouse. This was a mother who had survived a brutal pregnancy and built a kingdom from dust. "I'll be back before the moon hits the cliffs," she promised the quadruplets, kissing each of their foreheads in a ritual of protection. "Leo, you're in charge. Watch the gates. Stay in the secret kingdom." "We'll be here, Mama," Liana said, her eyes flashing with a precocious understanding. "No one gets past the vines." As Elena drove the battered truck away from the vineyard, she felt a strange, vibrating tension in the air. The vanishing was over. She was stepping back into the light, unaware that the collision she had spent 5 years avoiding was already in motion. The world she had escaped was about to reclaim her, and the secret of the 4 heartbeats was a ticking clock that was about to strike midnight. The metropolitan air was thick with the scent of rain and ambition, a stark contrast to the brine-washed silence of the vineyard. Elena stood at the edge of the grand ballroom of the Pierre Auguste Plaza, her heart a frantic bird trapped in the cage of her ribs. The gala was a celebration of the very tech merger she had spent the last 6 months strategically securing from the shadows. As the ghost, she was the guest of honor everyone wanted to meet, yet no one recognized her. She smoothed the fabric of her ink-black gown, her hazel contacts stinging slightly. She had done her homework. Dante Moretti wasn't supposed to be here. According to the internal memos she'd intercepted, he was finalizing a shipyard acquisition in Singapore. She was safe. She just had to navigate 2 hours of corporate pleasantries, sign the final retainer, and disappear back to the secret kingdom before the moon reached the cliffs. But the universe, it seemed, was finished with her vanishing act. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open with a synchronized precision that signaled the arrival of someone who didn't ask for entry. They commanded it. The room's chatter didn't stop. It curdled. Elena felt the temperature drop before she even turned around. It was a familiar, predatory chill. Dante Moretti walked in, flanked by 2 men whose tailored suits couldn't hide the bulk of holstered weapons. He looked exactly as he had 5 years ago, yet somehow more lethal. The gray in his eyes had hardened into steel, and the lines around his mouth spoke of a man who had won every war but lost his soul in the process. He wasn't in Singapore. He was here, standing less than 50 feet away from the woman he had tried to erase. Elena's first instinct was to run, but her legs were leaden. She forced herself to pick up a champagne flute, her knuckles white as she turned her back to him, blending into a circle of venture capitalists. "He doesn't know you," she whispered to herself. "You are a ghost. You are hazel-eyed and dark-haired. You are Elena Miller." The merger was a masterstroke. A nearby executive leaned in, oblivious to her internal collapse. "They say the strategist who pulled the strings is here tonight. A woman of mystery." Indeed. A voice vibrated behind her, a low melodic growl that haunted her nightmares. I've spent quite a few resources trying to identify the mind capable of outmaneuvering my own analysts. It would be a shame to leave tonight without an introduction. Elena froze. The champagne in her glass trembled, sending tiny ripples across the surface. She had no choice. To flee now would be an admission of guilt. To stay was a gamble with her life. She took a steadying breath, summoning every ounce of the fierce and protective spirit she taught her children, and turned around. Dante was standing close. Too close. The scent of his bourbon and sandalwood hit her like a physical blow, dragging her back to the mahogany study and the 6-0 check. His gaze was clinical, sweeping over her with the intensity of a searchlight. "Mr. Moretti," she said, her voice a polished, professional mask. "I wasn't aware the Moretti Syndicate took an interest in software logistics." Dante didn't respond immediately. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto hers. For a terrifying second, the hazel contacts felt transparent. He was looking for the girl he had discarded, but he was finding a woman who looked like she could command an army. "Information is the most valuable currency, Ms. Miller," Dante said, his voice dropping an octave. "And you seem to have a wealth of it. Tell me, why does a woman with your brilliance choose to live in the shadows? My people couldn't find a single record of you before 5 years ago. It's as if you simply materialized. I value my privacy, Mr. Moretti. In your world, you should understand the necessity of a clean slate." Dante stepped forward, invading her personal space. The air between them crackled with a tension that was part old flame, part new war. A clean slate is one thing. A void is another. You remind me of someone I once knew. Someone who thought she could walk away from a debt. "I owe you nothing," Elena snapped, the mask slipping for a fraction of a second. Dante's eyes flared. That was the mistake. The defiance in her voice was a fingerprint he recognized. He reached out, his hand hovering near her arm, not touching but claiming the space. "The woman I knew was soft. She was vulnerable. You are made of iron. But the eyes never lie, Elena." The use of her real name was a gunshot. Elena's heart stopped. "You're mistaken. My name is—" "Your name is whatever you want it to be," Dante interrupted, his voice a dangerous silk. "But the way you hold your shoulders when you're cornered, the way you look at me with that beautiful, righteous hatred, I'd know that anywhere." He leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. "I told you once that I didn't want a problem on my desk. I've spent 5 years wondering why the problem I managed felt like the only thing I ever truly possessed. Where have you been, Elena? And what else are you hiding in those shadows?" Before she could answer, a commotion at the entrance drew Dante's attention. His security detail stepped forward, sensing a shift in the room's energy. Elena didn't wait. She didn't look back. She slipped through the crowd, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm on the marble floor. She burst through the side exit into the rainy night, her lungs burning as she signaled for her car. As the black sedan sped away from the plaza, Elena looked in the rearview mirror. Dante was standing on the steps, a dark silhouette against the gold light of the gala. He wasn't chasing her. He was watching. He didn't need to chase her tonight. He had the scent. She pulled out her phone, her hand shaking so violently she almost dropped it. She called the vineyard. "Leo. Leo, listen to me," she gasped when the boy picked up. "Go to the safe room. Now. Take your siblings and don't come out until you hear my voice. The secret kingdom has been breached." The collision had happened. The ghost had been seen. And as she looked at the photos of her 4 children tucked into her sun visor, 4 faces that carried the Moretti legacy in every feature, She knew that Dante Moretti wouldn't stop until he saw what else she had materialized in the dark. The quiet sanctuary of the vineyard didn't fall to a siege of bullets. It fell to the overwhelming weight of Dante Moretti's shadow. Within 48 hours of the gala, the world Elena had meticulously built began to dissolve. First, it was the small things. The local grocer, who usually barely grunted a greeting, delivered 3 crates of the finest organic produce and imported chocolates he couldn't possibly stock, murmuring that a friend of the family had settled the tab for the next year. Then, the gravel road leading to the cliffs, which had been pockmarked and treacherous for a decade, was paved overnight by a crew of silent men who vanished before dawn. Elena stood on the porch, her hand white-knuckled around the railing as she watched the children play in the garden. They were oblivious to the invisible net closing around them, delighted by the magic that had begun to happen. But Elena knew. This was Dante's version of a courtship, a tactical, high-stakes invasion designed to prove that there was nowhere his reach couldn't touch. The first true confrontation happened on a Tuesday. The Quadruplets were in their secret kingdom, a clearing near the ancient oak tree, when a sleek black SUV pulled into the driveway. It didn't belong to the local sheriff or a deliveryman. It moved with the predatory grace of a shark. Elena intercepted him before he could reach the porch. Dante stepped out of the vehicle, looking entirely out of place in his $1,000 suit against the rugged, salt-sprayed landscape. He held a large, brightly colored box under one arm. "Leave, Dante," Elena said, her voice a low warning. "You have no right to be here." "I have the right of a man who has discovered he's been lied to for 5 years," Dante replied, his voice calm but vibrating with an underlying fury. He looked past her, his eyes locking onto the 4 small figures in the distance. He froze. The color drained from his face, replaced by a raw, unshielded shock. He had expected a child. He hadn't expected a legacy. "4," he whispered, the word sounding like a prayer or a curse. "Elena, you had 4. "I had them alone," she snapped, stepping into his line of sight to block his view. "I birthed them alone. I fed them alone. While you were managing your mergers and marrying into the DeLuca family, I was building a life that has nothing to do with you. You said you didn't want a child. Well, congratulations. You don't have any. You have a problem you can't manage with a check." Dante didn't look angry. He looked shattered, though the cracks were only visible to someone who had once known his heart. He looked down at the box in his hand, a high-tech drone set, and then back at the children. "I never married the DeLuca girl. I broke the treaty the week after you vanished. I spent 3 years looking for you, Elena. And then I spent the last 2 trying to convince myself I didn't care that I hadn't found you." "Don't lie to me," she hissed. "You sent me away with a death sentence for my dignity. Now get in your car and go back to your throne." But Dante didn't leave. Over the next week, the invasion intensified. He bought the mortgage on the vineyard from the bank. He hired a private security firm to patrol the perimeter, replacing Elena's makeshift sensors with military-grade thermal imaging. He didn't force his way into the house, but he made sure he was a constant, looming presence. He would sit in his car at the end of the driveway for hours, watching the children through binoculars, or he would leave extravagant gifts on the gatepost. Telescopes, handcrafted wooden horses, and books on astronomy. The children, driven by a curiosity Elena couldn't suppress, began to notice the man in the black car. "Is he a giant, Mama?" Luna asked one evening, clutching a silk-wrapped doll she had found on the porch. "He leaves things like a forest spirit." "He's just a man, Luna," Elena said, her heart breaking. "A man who stayed away too long." The tension reached a boiling point when Elena found Leo, her most protective son, standing at the gate talking to Dante. Dante was crouched down, meeting the boy's eye level, showing him how to calibrate the drone. They looked so much alike, The same set of the jaw, the same intense focus, that Elena felt a physical pain in her chest. "Leo, get away from him!" she cried, rushing forward. Leo looked at her, his expression confused. "But Mama, he knows about the wind speeds. He says the vineyard needs better irrigation. He says he's an old friend." Elena grabbed Leo's hand and pulled him back. She turned to Dante, her eyes burning with tears of rage. "This is stalking, Dante. This is harassment. You think you can just buy your way into their hearts? You think a few toys make up for 5 years of silence?" "I'm not trying to buy them, Elena," Dante said, standing up. His face was weary, the arrogance of the CEO replaced by a desperate, hollow longing. "I've spent my life building an empire because I thought power was the only thing that could keep me safe. But looking at them, looking at Leo, I realize I've been building a tomb. I don't want the syndicate. I want a chance to be the man I was before I became a Moretti." "That man is dead," Elena said coldly. "And you killed him the day you slid that envelope across the desk." She dragged Leo back toward the house, but as she reached the porch, she looked back. Dante was still standing at the gate, a solitary figure in the fading light. He didn't look like a mafia boss. He looked like a man who had finally realized that the only things worth having are the things you can't take by force. But the world Dante had built was not so easily abandoned. As he stood there, watching his family, a pair of eyes watched him from the tree-line. The Moretti campaign of invasion had drawn a map right to Elena's doorstep, and Dante wasn't the only one following it. The peaceful facade of the vineyard shattered on a Thursday evening when the fog rolled in thicker than usual, smelling not of salt but of ozone and impending disaster. Dante had been gone for 2 days, reportedly back in the city to clean house, but his security detail remained, a perimeter of black-clad men that Elena had grown to resent. However, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the thermal sensors she had learned to monitor began to blink red in a pattern that wasn't a patrol. It was a breach. "Leo, take them to the cellar. Now." Elena's voice was a whip-crack of authority. She didn't wait for them to argue. The children, sensing the shift from the secret kingdom to a very real nightmare, moved with the synchronized speed she had drilled into them. Luca grabbed Luna's hand. Liana took the lead, her face a mask of miniature defiance. Elena reached into the hollowed-out base of a floor lamp and pulled out a sleek, compact firearm, a gift she'd bought herself years ago but hoped never to use. She wasn't just a mother. She was a woman who had been hunted by the best, and she knew that if Dante's invasion had found her, his enemies weren't far behind. The first shot shattered the kitchen window, showering the floor in diamonds of glass. Elena dropped to her knees, her heart thundering. Outside, the silent professionalism of the Moretti guards was being met by the chaotic, brutal force of the Ricci syndicate. Dante's primary rivals who had been humiliated by his broken treaty 5 years ago. They didn't want the vineyard. They wanted the leverage. They wanted the quadruplets. "Where are they?" A voice boomed from the porch, followed by the heavy thud of a boot against the door. Elena fired through the woods, a warning shot that bought her seconds. She retreated toward the cellar door, her mind racing. She was outnumbered and outgunned, but she was on her home turf. Suddenly, the front door didn't just open, it exploded off its hinges. Dante Moretti stormed in, not in a suit, but in tactical gear, his face streaked with grease and fury. He didn't look like a CEO. He looked like the angel of death. He fired a rhythmic sequence into the shadows of the porch before slamming the door shut and bracing it with a heavy sideboard. "Elena, are they safe?" He roared over the sound of returned fire. "In the cellar. Why are they here, Dante? You brought this to my house." She screamed, her eyes burning with tears of terror for her children. "I tried to cut the head off the snake, but the Riccis had a contingency," Dante said, reloading with a mechanical fluidness that spoke of a dark history. He looked at her, his steel-gray eyes filled with a desperate, raw honesty. "I'm sorry. I thought I could keep the two worlds separate. I was wrong. But I will die before they touch one hair on those children's heads." The siege lasted for 20 agonizing minutes. The farmhouse, once a place of healing, was riddled with bullet holes. Dante moved like a ghost through the rooms he had once only watched from a distance, neutralizing threats with a cold, terrifying efficiency. But the Ricci's were relentless. A flashbang grenade detonated in the hallway, blinding Elena and ringing in her ears. Through the haze, she saw a shadow lunging toward the cellar door. "No!" she shrieked, lunging forward with a kitchen knife she'd grabbed from the counter. She was swiped aside, hitting the wall with a sickening thud. The attacker reached for the cellar latch, but before he could pull it, Dante was there. He didn't use his gun. He used his bare hands, his movements a blur of primal violence. He tackled the man through the railing of the stairs, the two of them crashing into the foyer below. Dante rose, blood dripping from a cut on his forehead, his chest heaving. He stood over the cellar door like a guardian at the gates of hell. "Go back," Dante shouted at the shadows outside. "Tell Ricci that if he wants my blood, he can have it. But if he sets one foot on this soil again, I will burn his entire world to the ground with him inside it." The remaining attackers, seeing their leader fallen and facing a man who had clearly lost his fear of death, retreated into the fog. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. Dante slumped against the cellar door, his strength finally deserting him. Elena crawled toward him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched his shoulder. "They're okay," she whispered, more to herself than him. Dante looked up at her, the mask of the Mafia boss completely shattered. He looked at the blood on his hands, the blood he had shed to protect the life he had once tried to discard. "I owe a debt, Elena," he choked out, his voice breaking. "A blood debt for 5 years of silence. And I think the bill just came due." From the cellar, a small voice drifted up. "Mama, is the giant still here?" Dante's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, Elena didn't see the monster. She saw the father. The aftermath of the Ricci assault left the vineyard smelling of gunpowder and wet earth. While the immediate threat had retreated into the fog, the reality of their situation was a jagged glass floor they all had to walk upon. Dante sat on the bottom step of the porch, his tactical vest discarded, a white bandage stark against the dark blood matting his hair. For the first time, the children weren't hiding. They stood in a semicircle a few feet away, watching this stranger who had fought like a demon to keep the door closed. Leo was the first to move. He walked forward and handed Dante a damp cloth. Their eyes met, steel gray meeting steel gray, and in that silent exchange, the boy saw the man's soul. Dante took the cloth with a trembling hand, his voice a broken rasp. "Thank you, Leo." Elena stood in the doorway, watching them. The anger that had sustained her for 5 years was warring with a new, terrifying clarity. Dante had been right. The two worlds could not coexist. As long as he was the head of the Moretti syndicate, her children would always have a bullseye on their backs. "You have to leave, Dante," she said, her voice devoid of its usual sharp edge. "This isn't a life. I won't raise them in a bunker, waiting for the next flashbang." Dante stood up, swaying slightly. He looked at the vineyard, then at the 4 faces that were the only pure things he had ever touched. "I know," he whispered. "I've spent my life thinking that the throne was the only way to protect what was mine. But the throne is what put them in danger. I've been a king of ashes, Elena." He turned to his lead security officer, a man who had been with him since he was a boy. "Call the commission. Tell them I'm invoking the ultima ratio. I am stepping down. Effective immediately. The officer gasped. Sir, you can't. Without the title you have no immunity. The De Lucases, the Ricci's. They'll come for you with everything they have. You're signing your own death warrant. Then let them come for me, Dante said, his gaze fixed on Elena. I am going to give them the one thing they want more than my life. The Moretti Empire. I will dismantle the syndicate piece by piece. I will hand the keys to the federal authorities and the rival families in exchange for one thing. A permanent ironclad hands-off order for this vineyard and everyone in it. Elena stepped forward, her heart seizing. Dante, if you do that, you'll have nothing. You'll be a man with a target on his back and no army to shield you. They'll kill you within a month. Then I'll have lived 1 month as a father instead of a lifetime as a monster, he replied. The sacrifice was total. Over the next 48 hours, Dante stayed in the vineyard's small study, his fingers flying across a laptop just as Elena's once had. He was performing a corporate autopsy on his own life. He leaked encrypted files to the Department of Justice, signed over shipping manifests to the De Lucases, and emptied his private offshore accounts into a trust for the quadruplets that even he could no longer touch. He was stripping himself bare, peeling away the layers of the Mafia boss until there was nothing left but the man. On the final night, a black sedan arrived. Not a syndicate car, but a neutral transport. Dante stood on the porch, his bags packed. He looked older, the weight of his choice etched into the lines of his face, but his eyes were clearer than Elena had ever seen them. The Ricci's have signed the peace treaty, Dante said quietly. They got the docks. The De Lucases got the union contracts. The feds got enough evidence to keep the rest of them busy for a decade. You're safe now, Elena. Truly safe. The Moretti name is dead. And what about you? She asked, her voice thick with unshed tears. Dante looked out at the rows of grapes. I'm going to a safe house in the city to finish the depositions. After that, I don't know. I'm a man without a country. He knelt as the children approached. He didn't try to hug them. He knew he hadn't earned that yet. He simply looked at each of them. Leo, Luca, Liana, and Luna. Memorizing their faces as if they were the last things he would ever see. Listen to your mother, he told them. She is the bravest person I have ever known. And remember, you were never a mistake. You were the only thing I ever got right. As he walked toward the car, Leo ran forward and grabbed his hand. Will you come back? To see the drone. Dante's shoulders shook. He didn't turn around, afraid the children would see the tears of a man who had once been a king. If your mother allows it, Leo. I will try. Elena watched the car disappear into the fog. She looked at her children, then at the bullet holes in her home, and finally at the empty road. Dante had given up an empire to give them a life. He had chosen them over the poison of his world. It was a sacrifice that shouldn't have been necessary, but it was the only foundation upon which a new world could be built. 3 seasons passed at the vineyard, the cycle of the grapes mirroring the slow, deliberate healing of the Vance household. The bullet holes had been patched, the shattered glass replaced, and the air no longer carried the metallic tang of ozone. Elena sat on the porch, watching the quadruplets help her grandfather's old foreman with the harvest. They were taller now, their movements filled with a grace that was no longer haunted by the need to hide. The secret kingdom had expanded to include the whole world. Dante Moretti was no longer a name that commanded fear in the city. To the public, he was a fallen titan, a man who had vanished after a massive federal investigation dismantled his family's holdings. But to Elena, he had become something entirely different, a man of relentless consistency. He didn't return with a grand gesture or a suitcase full of money. Instead, he returned 3 months after the sacrifice in a used sedan, wearing a plain cotton shirt and carrying a toolbox. He didn't ask to stay in the house. He rented a small, weathered cottage in the village and showed up every Saturday at 8 a.m. sharp. He didn't come to manage. He came to work. At first, Elena watched him from the window with a guarded heart. She watched him mend the fences he had once used as a tactical perimeter. She watched him learn the delicate art of pruning the vines, his once manicured hands becoming calloused and stained with the earth. He never pushed for more than she was willing to give. He accepted every no with a quiet nod and returned the next week to try again. "He's still here, Mama," Liana noted one afternoon, watching Dante fix a leak in the irrigation line. "He's been here for 12 Saturdays. He doesn't look like a giant anymore. He just looks like Dante." Elena realized then that the giant had been the myth she used to protect herself. The man working in the dirt was the reality. Transformation, she understood, wasn't a single event. It wasn't the sacrifice of the throne or the dismantling of the syndicate. It was the choice to show up when it was boring, when it was hard, and when there was no audience to applaud. The turning point came on a warm evening in late autumn. The harvest was done, and the vineyard was bathed in a soft amber light. Dante was packing his tools into his car when Leo approached him, holding a broken wooden airplane. "Can you fix it?" the boy asked, his voice cautious. Liana stepped on it during the pack hunt. Dante stopped, his eyes softening as he took the toy. "I can try, Leo. But it might take some time. We have to be patient with things that have been broken." Elena walked down the porch steps, her heart finally releasing the last of its defensive weight. She saw the way Dante handled the toy, with the same reverence he now showed her children. He wasn't trying to be a king. He was trying to be a father. "The sun is going down," Elena said, her voice steady. "There's enough stew for a guest, if that guest is willing to wash his hands." Dante looked up, and the look of pure, humble gratitude in his eyes was more powerful than any declaration of love he had ever whispered in the dark. "I'd like that, Elena. Very much." That dinner was the first of many. They didn't talk about the syndicate or the envelope or the years of silence. They talked about the children's school, the quality of the soil, and the way the moon looked over the cliffs. It wasn't perfect, and the scars of the past were still there, but they were no longer open wounds. They were the foundation. Dante proved his redemption not through power, but through his absence of it. He became the man who cheered the loudest at Luca's soccer matches, the man who sat with Luna when she had nightmares about the fog, and the man who taught Leo that true strength was found in the ability to protect without destroying. He had traded an empire for a seat at a kitchen table, and by the look on his face as he laughed with his 4 children, he knew he had won the better half of the deal. As the first snow began to fall over the vineyard, Elena stood by the window, watching Dante and the Quadruplets build a lopsided snowman in the yard. She felt a hand on her shoulder, warm, steady, and no longer threatening. She didn't pull away. "We made it," Dante whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "We survived," Elena corrected softly, turning to look at him. "Now we get to live." The transformation was complete. The Mafia boss was gone, and the mother was no longer a fugitive. In the quiet of the northern coast, a family that shouldn't have existed had found its way home, proving that even the darkest shadows can be chased away by the relentless light of a love that refuses to give up. The end.